My favorite customer quote is generalized intelligence is great, but I don't need my point of sale system to recite French poetry. I think that customers actually have this intuition that bigger is it better. And we don't always even have to convince them that much. They sort of hate this idea that they're paying for this general purpose, high capacity model to be able to do something really rote. Like, I just want it to be able to classify my calls and tell me, did I request a follow-up or not?
Welcome to Founded and Funded. I'm Vivek Ramaswami, and today I have the pleasure of hosting Dev Rishi and Travis Addair, co-founders of 2023 IA40 Rising Star, Predibase. Predibase is a platform for developers to easily fine-tune and serve any open source model. They recently released LoRA Land, a collection of 25 highly performant open source fine-tuned models, and launched open source LoRA Exchange, or LoRAX, which allows users to pack hundreds of task-specific models into a single GPU. In this episode, Dev and Travis share their perspective on what it takes to commercialize open source projects, how to build a product your customers actually want, and how to differentiate in a very noisy AI infrastructure market. This is a must listen for anyone building an AI. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button. With that, here's Dev and Travis. So to kick us off, maybe we can just start off by telling us a little bit about the founding story at Predibase. Dev, you were a PM at Google in the Bay for about 5 years. Travis, you were a senior software engineer at Uber in Seattle for about 4 years. How did you meet and co-found Predibase in 2021?
The company originally started out of Uber. Our co-founder, Piero, was working at the time as an AI researcher for Uber's AI team on a project called Ludwig. And he and I worked together. And he came to me in, I think, March of 2020, saying that he thought that there was an interesting opportunity to productize a lot of what the ideas from Ludwig around making deep learning accessible and thinking about bringing that to other industries, other organizations, other personas beyond the data scientists, but folks like analysts and engineers as well. And so it started getting a lot more serious in the summer of 2020. And then we started saying, we definitely need someone who's not completely technical, completely engineer. Let's try to find someone who knows how to build good products and can help also think about some of the go-to-market issues. And then that's how we ultimately came to meet Dev. I think every other person that I had talked to up to that point was like very, bi-directional conversation. Like, what are you guys doing? What do you think the opportunity is? And a lot of selling on our side. And then Dev came in with like a presentation of like, here's how I think that you can turn this into a business. And it's like, okay, this guy's pretty serious.
And on my side, Vic, so I had spent time previous to Predibase as a PM at Google, worked on a number of different teams. I saw how Google did machine learning internally. And so for a little while, I was actually kind of jaded on this idea of make deep learning and machine learning a lot easier. I'd seen it and we had tried to do it at Google and it hadn't really gone, I think, as well as we wanted. And so I originally got in touch with Pierre and Travis through a mutual contact because I got introduced as a skeptic on this space. I think the thing that I had said was, I've seen a lot of people die on this hill of trying to make machine learning a lot more accessible. And I remember the first meeting I had with Pierre and Travis, I didn't actually understand what I think the vision directly was. But then I tried the projects that they had tried in the open source, and they walked me through a presentation of how they were thinking about it. And that's when it sort of clicked. And I knew that there actually was something here that could be a more differentiated approach. We all got to essentially know each other over the summer of 2020, and we officially started the company at the beginning of 2021.
It's funny how different the deep learning, machine learning space was just, 3-4 years ago compared to where we are today. And so it's almost hard for people to think, people were jaded about it when you see all of the optimism today. So I'm curious, like, what was the aha moment when things really clicked? And, you mentioned, Travis, that the original vision was around Ludwig and these open source projects. And often there's a lot of difficulty in going from cool open source project to, is this a business? So what was that aha moment? When did you start to see things really click?
I think what really convinced me about the idea of making deep learning accessible was more so just an extrapolation of what I perceived to be a trend that was happening in the industry, which was kind of on two different fronts. One was like, the kind of consolidation of data infrastructure from like data swamps and data lakes and unstructured towards like more canonical systems of record for data. So data was getting better and getting more organized. And then the other was on the modeling side, that model architectures were consolidating as well towards transformer-based architectures. And there were only a handful of models that people were actually using in production and fine-tuning, as opposed to like having to build novel model architectures from scratch with low-level tools like PyTorch. And so my bet was that eventually these things were going to converge, and the idea of training or fine-tuning models on proprietary data would be kind of like a one-click type operation in a lot of cases, where you're not having to think very critically about how many layers the model has or having to do a lot of intense manual data engineering. That was just going to be much more about the business use case, the kind of level of the problem that someone like an analyst or someone like an engineer would work at, as opposed to a data scientist. I definitely think that that has been proven out to some extent over time. Of course, I'm sure we'll get into it, but I think with large language models, it happened in a bit of a more of like a lightning flash as opposed to like a slow burn. But definitely I think that that trend is continuing.
Look, you led me to the next question, which is, you talked about large language models being this lightning flash, right? And it's interesting. Predibase was founded. You all started talking in the summer of 2020 together and officially formed the company. And when we think about the start of this most recent AI moment or AI era, it's really when ChatGPT was released at the end of 2022 and everyone started talking about large language models and AI. So it's so interesting talking to all these companies that were founded before that moment and hearing, how has the original vision changed or not changed since, ChatGPT was released and since this, in this pre-LLM era.
It's funny because I think a cheeky answer to this question could be that our vision actually hasn't necessarily changed that much, but our tactics have changed entirely. So our vision initially was as a platform for anyone to be able to start to build deep learning models. And we initially started with analysts as an audience, actually data analysts in 2021. We had an entire interface built around a SQL-like engine that allowed them to use deep learning models immediately. And that's actually where the name Predibase came from. Predibase is short for predictive database. And the idea was, let's take the same types of constructs that we've brought for database systems and bring it towards deep learning and machine learning. I think at the end of that year, we found that analysts really weren't our niche. The people who really wanted to use us were more like developers, engineers, the types of people that were along the lines of, hey, just give me some good technical documentation and I'll figure this out. And so that's where we started to shift from an audience standpoint. But our vision was, okay, how do we make deep learning accessible towards this type of audience? When we started pitching deep learning in 2021 to a lot of organizations, I think we came up with the value propositions of deep learning as, hey, you can start to work with unstructured data like text, images. You get better performance at scale. And oh yeah, you can use some of them pre-trained. And that way you don't need as much data to be able to start to get your initial results. I think the biggest change that's actually really happened is that last value proposition, which was kind of third on our list, has become the most important thing that people have actually started to care about. Which if I think about, what was really popular in our platform in 2022, people's eyes sort of glazed over when we said deep learning is really cool. But what they liked was we had this drop-down menu where you could select different text models. And one of them was a really heavyweight model called BERT. So you could start to use it pre-trained. They didn't need as much data to be able to get started. And they loved the idea that they could actually maybe fine-tune it inside of that platform. And at the time, it was just one feature, among many other things that we'd done in the platform, among many other value props. But in 2023, when large language models came out in a large way, I think we started to think about what do we want our platform to be? And to be honest, one of our very first takes, maybe one of my very first takes specifically, was LLMs are just another drop-down item in the menu. So you had BERT and all these other menu of deep learning models, and now we're going to add Llama as an example. What I think actually we needed to recognize was, in order for us to be able to get to that vision of where deep learning models were, like the market had changed how it thought about machine learning. It was no longer thinking about training models first and then getting results after it. It was thinking about prompting, fine-tuning, and then reprompting a fine-tuned model overall. And so our tactics significantly shifted. We considered a product pivot that we did in 2023 to be able to actually better support large language models. But funnily enough, I think it's actually still in service of that vision of how do we make deep learning accessible for developers.
It's funny hearing you say that. It's almost as if the vision has stayed the same. It's the market has come to you in some ways, right? It's like, hey, we were talking about deep learning and machine learning and before it was quote unquote cool in the current context, and large language models, I think, have just opened up a whole new sphere of who you can market to.
Yeah, I think we definitely got lucky there. I also think we had to meet the market halfway. We had to make sure that, we also were responsive and not trying to do or meet the market, using our old form factors or old tactics. But the market did come to us in essentially figuring out, hey, there's 3 value propositions you mentioned. 1 or 2 of these really matter. How do you center kind of your offering around that? And I think that's been one of the most helpful things for a business. Really, as a startup, I find like one of the biggest challenges is getting people to care. How do you get anyone from, another startup organization to spend 45 minutes with you, or a large enterprise? And one of the really nice things that's happened over the last year and a half is we no longer have to explain why deep learning matters. All we do is we frame it as LLMs and kind of being able to fine tune those.
And this is a question for both of you. I mean, but you talk about the big thing for startups, and a lot of the founders who listen to this podcast will attest to the same, is you have this great idea in your head and you see the tech maybe before anybody else does, but then there's a question of, well, why should we care, right? How do you go from figuring out this is a cool open source project to this is something we can actually commercialize and people and businesses are willing to pay for this?
I think that's definitely the right point. I think a lot of open source projects are very popular in GitHub. And I do think a subset of those are probably best as open source software. They're a framework that makes something really easy, but doesn't necessarily need the full depth of a commercial or enterprise-ready product for it. And no one actually knows more about these types of challenges of actually taking some of these open source frameworks and running on the infrastructure than Travis, I think, who's been working directly on it, both for Predibase as well as with users that have tried to use this kind of independently themselves. And so for us, I think we got lucky. And I think Travis can actually talk a little bit about the challenges we saw of translating open source frameworks without a commercial offering and why we thought there was a real commercial business to be built around these frameworks.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that when it comes to open source and particularly like open core models, I think the easiest argument to make is that at Uber, we had a team of like 50 to 100 engineers that were working on building infrastructure for training and serving models. And the cost of that is quite significant, even for a company like Uber. But for companies that don't consider this part of their core business, maybe they consider it core infrastructure, but it's not like differentiated IP for them. You could invest in building an entire team around it, or you could just pay a company like Predibase to help solve those challenges for you. Definitely, I think that, with, like our most recent project, LoRAX, for example, I think that there's a really good open source piece of software that can be productized and productionized and used in situations where you need, high availability, low latency, all those sorts of things. But that sort of layer on top, we have quite a lot of internal software that's been running on top of Kubernetes and running across multiple data centers to really optimize the availability, latency, throughput of the system that goes above what's in the open source. And, I think that that's inevitable when you're talking about something that's going to be used day in and day out, thousands of times a day, that those sorts of what start off seeming like long tail issues, like, oh, like this request failed or the service was down for some period of time, become mission critical at a certain point. And that's, I think, where there's a really good opportunity to appeal to organizations that need that. And there's a good synergy, I think, where they need like those particular levels of service and we're able to offer it. And that's something that they're willing to pay for at that point.
It's an interesting point. And it sounds like, unlike many other open source projects where you start the open source project and then you say, hey, let's see if people are willing to pay or not. This is almost where at the very start of it, you knew that there is a willingness to pay given your time at Uber and having seen this scale. But let's start with this open source project and start with this product that's out there, get people to try it. And there's definitely a willingness to pay. So it's a different angle than I think we see many open source projects that are out there. You wait for a lot of people to use it and say, hey, are people willing to pay or not? And then it's a different debate you have at that point.
Dev actually has a really good analogy about the front of the kitchen, back of the kitchen when it comes to this sort of thing. And I think that serving definitely is this very like front-facing thing where you have to get every detail right. Like, and those minor differences make a huge difference in terms of the overall value of what you're offering. So yeah, I'm not sure, Dev, if you wanted to maybe speak more to that.
I have two analogies that I'm actually going to throw out. But the first analogy I think about with open source projects is kind of to your point of, is there a commercially viable business around this? The way I think about it is, for us, the way we've, Ludwig and LoRAX are sort of the engine. And what we're trying to do is sell the car. So there are some people, maybe advanced auto manufacturers, who just want an engine and they want to put it in their tractor or some other kind of setup. But most people want to be able to buy the fully functioning car, something that's going to, allow me to unlock the doors and have a steering wheel and other things along those lines, which in our world is the ability to connect to enterprise data sources, deploy into a virtual private cloud, give you observability and deployments that you don't necessarily get if you were just to be able to run the open source projects directly. And finally, connect that engine to a gas line, which I think, in our world would again be the underlying GPUs, cloud infrastructure that this is going to run on. And then the second analogy that I'd call out is like, that's how we think about the product. And then the other piece you always have to figure out is, how much does what the core problem that the open source product is solving really matter to that end customer, and like, what's the visibility around it? And that's where I think about, there's some things that can be done in the back of the house as a kitchen, where maybe someone has an internal pipeline for doing something, and it doesn't need to be pretty, doesn't need to be production ready. It could be so much better if they had this commercial product that was built on top of the open source, but it's not necessarily mission critical, or they're not going to lose customers and users because it doesn't work flawlessly. Think about these as especially like those internal sell pipelines. And then I think about the front of the house, which to me is taking, for example, fine-tuned models and being able to serve them very well. Things that are actually going to go in front of customers and user traffic. This is the part of the restaurant that you want to make sure actually services folks really, really well. And so I'll need to figure out how to combine the car analogy and the restaurant analogy. But to me, I think the car analogy is how we figure out what's the commercial viability around the open source projects. And the restaurant analogy is a little bit of like how you think about if an open source project is going to be important enough to be able to justify some of that commercial viability.
I love it. Don't be surprised if we steal both of those analogies for some of our own companies, because I think it's really important distinction, like, selling the car versus the engine, front of the house versus the back of the house. At the end of the day, all of these things roll up to what's most important for customers, right? And, one of the things that I love when we talk about front of the house, or even what people see, is on your website, you have a great tagline, which is bigger isn't always better. And for a long time, I think really with the explosion of GPT and everything we've been hearing from them, we've been hearing about these models with billions of parameters. And for a while it was, hey, bigger is better, and we got to create the best model, and how many parameters is GPT-5 going to be, and so on and so forth. In your view, why is bigger not always better? And specifically related to models and the customers you serve, where do you find that bigger is not always better?
My favorite customer quote is, generalized intelligence is great, but I don't need my point of sale system to recite French poetry. I think that, customers actually have this intuition that bigger is it better. And we don't always even have to convince them that much. They sort of hate this idea that they're paying for this general purpose, high capacity model to be able to do something really rote. Like, I just wanted to be able to classify my calls and tell me, did I request a follow-up or not? It's like a very common type of task that people might be able to do, using GPT-4. And today they have a model that can do everything from that to French poetry to write code. And I think there's actually this intuition that when you're using a really large model like that, you're paying for all that excess capacity, both in terms of the literal dollars, but also in the latency, reliability, and kind of deferred ownership. And so when I talk to customers, I think they're actually very enamored with this idea of smaller task-specific models that they can actually own and deploy that are right-sized towards their task. What they need is a really good solution for something very, very narrow. Where I think the actual trick is that customers have is, well, can those small models do as well as the big models? And it's very fair. If you've played around with some of these open source models, especially some of the base model versions, you kind of have that intuition. They don't do as well as the big models, like as soon as you start to prompt them. And that's where we've spent a lot of our time kind of investing in research to figure out what actually allows a small model to do and punch above its weight and be as good as a large model. And to us, what we've kind of just found to unlock, it might not be a massive secret, but it's really been around data and fine tuning. And so what we found is if you fine tune a much smaller model, like a 7 billion parameter model, a 2 billion parameter model, probably an order or 2 orders of magnitude smaller than some of the bigger models people are using, you can actually get a parity with or even outperform the larger models. And you can do it a lot more in a lot more cost-effective way, and also be able to do it a lot faster. So you don't have to wait for that spinner that you often see with some of these larger models.
Yeah, I think a big aspect of this that every organization should think about is the type of tasks that they're trying to do with the model. I think that if you're primarily interested in very open-ended tasks where you do want to be able to, like a chat application where you want to be able to ask it anything from generate French poetry to solve this math problem to whatever, you do need a lot of capacity. And so that's why ChatGPT is as successful as it is because when a user comes in and uses it, they don't know a priori like what type of question the user is going to have in mind, right? So you do need something very general purpose. But when you're productionize something behind an API, it's just like an endpoint, like you're calling it saying, classify this document. And you're just going to call that over and over and over again, thousands of times. You really don't need all those extra parameters, just kind of at the baseline. And at that point, it really depends on how complex your task is, the capacity of the model that you need. And the less capacity you need, the smaller model you can use, the lower latency. So it really goes on a task-by-task basis that people should be evaluating these sorts of things.
And I think, I feel like we are now in the moment of time where we are seeing that the balance swing back to, okay, actually, I might not need this really, really massive model with 1 trillion parameters and all of that. I just really need something that works for me, right? That works for my use case. And, Dev, you mentioned customers there and what your customers have been saying to you. Take us to the first customer. How did your first customer come through the door? How did you land them?
I wish there was a very repeatable lesson for founders here, but sometimes your first customer is a little bit of luck mixed with just a little bit of internal network and elbow grease. So I remember we started the company in March 2021, and I had no idea how we were supposed to get our first customer. What people told us is the common advice, and I think this is correct, is your first few customers are probably in your network. But looking kind of initially at my network, I didn't know really where to start kind of digging. And we ended up getting actually inbounded from a large healthcare company based here in the US. And they were curious just to know they had seen Ludwig out there. They weren't even active users at the time, but they had seen Ludwig and they'd seen it actually solve a very specific use case that Uber had published a case study around, which was customer service automation. And they wanted to know if there was something that could be applied with Ludwig inside their organization. And I'll never forget, the very first customer meeting that we had was with this organization. We started in March. This customer meeting was in April. And it was an hour meeting where we kind of walked them through what Ludwig had been, but for a few minutes, but also what our vision and what we were building with Predibase. And the meeting ended with, if you guys have a design partner sign-up sheet, just put our name on that list. And that was the end of the very first kind of customer meeting that we had. It came in because of that open source sort of credibility. And I walked away being like, are they all that easy? They're not, just as a very quick recap. But the first one for us did sort of come in a way through network, but really actually from organic open source inbound that came through. From there, what we've actually been found really helpful is, or like the repeatable lesson I can think about there was, it was a piece of content that kind of attacked a use case that somebody cared about. And that allowed them to actually come to us. And I think that's actually something we still see as a pretty effective channel now as we're landing our next sets of customers as well.
See, folks, it's just that easy. Just, start the company and a month later, someone's going to ping you. But having that channel, as you mentioned, like this is sort of one of the great benefits of open source is people can start playing with it, and someone may find intrinsically there's a lot of value and just say, hey, how do we go from where we are today to doing even more with this? Zooming out a little bit, the AI infrastructure space has become very, very crowded. It seems like there's a lot of infra companies building at the inference layer, at the training layer, doing things around fine tuning. And I would say often to the outside observer, and even sometimes to the inside observer, it's hard to tell what's real, what's working, what's the difference. Do we need all these products? And I think in some ways it's really healthy because it gives people a lot of options. And I think when we're early in the AI era, as we are right now, you need a lot of these options, and there's a lot of space to build. How do you both think about it? Like, I guess there's a day-to-day of just maybe there's hand-to-hand combat against some products, some more than others, maybe. And then there's just the long term of how do we resonate and stay above the noise and build for the long term.
Yeah, you're right that I think this market is extremely competitive and that there is a lot of noise that kind of gets introduced into the system. I think that in terms of staying above the noise, the only way that we have found to be effective to actually stand out as an organization, especially when you don't have that hour with a customer, you need to go ahead and build a brand where people are just going to look at you for maybe a few seconds or a minute and kind of make an assessment of, is this worth my time? The only way that we've seen work is you have to do work that sort of advances the ecosystem yourself. And so what I'm actually saying is I actually think you need to do something that it can be a narrow slice, but somewhat novel or a differentiated take. And there's two ways that we've thought about doing this. The first is people have always liked this idea that small task-specific models that are fine-tuned will be able to dominate these larger models. I spoke with a customer that said something that stuck with me. He said, I want to believe. I want to believe that these small task-specific models actually will be the way my organization will go. And I want to use open source. But I just don't know if it actually works. And the world out there today is a lot of anecdotal experiments, memes on Twitter and others. And so one of the first things we did is we actually started to just benchmark data and put out results from our benchmark. And so we put out a launch in February called LoRA Land, both a mix of LoRA Land as well as the play on LoRA fine tuning, which is how we kind of did the process, where we took 29 data sets and we just fine-tuned Mistral 7 billion against those data sets. And we just wanted to compare initially to see how much does fine-tuning help against the base model. What we actually found was fine-tuned Mistral 7 billion will be at parity with, or in actually many cases outperform GPT-4. When we do some prompt engineering and try and find prompts that work the best for both of them, it'll actually outperform that one out of the box. And so that I actually think became a moment where we went semi-viral. So, we were at the top of Reddit for a little while. We had a partnership with Hugging Face and Mistral to go ahead and reshare it. Jan at Meta also, I think, reshared this. And it was a way for us just to start to put some data in the industry. And we also released all these models as open source. We even built a little interactive playground where people could play around with these models directly firsthand and start to see what actually what the model performances was like. And from there, we've scaled this out 10 times. So we've actually not only now trained 27 models, but we've trained over 270 ones because we stopped just benchmarking Mistral. People would say, what about Llama 2? What about Microsoft's Phi? And so we've actually added a number of different models, Google's Gemma, to this entire list. And we've started to just build out our own internal benchmarking to understand what is the fine-tuning LLM leaderboard. And we've put this content out there. We put these models out there. And there's actually going to be more about on that very soon. So that was one way that we thought about advancing the ecosystem. And the second way I would say is honestly building novel frameworks that didn't exist before. And I think the best example of this is LoRAX. And I'll let Travis speak towards LoRAX as, the lead author and kind of creator of the framework. But one of the things that I think made it very popular was we attacked a problem in a way that no one else had been thinking about. And that really helped us cut above the noise.
I definitely think that, to Dev's point, attacking a narrow slice of the market is the only way that I found to be able to kind of stay above the noise. I mean, I think the reality is that, we talked about how pre-LLMs, so much of our focus was on getting people to care or even understand what the value proposition was. And now it's, everyone cares. Therefore, there's tons of people in the market competing for attention. And many of them are much better capitalized than we are, right? We're talking about companies that have hundreds, thousands of employees in some cases working on this stuff. And so for us, the challenge, I think, was definitely on a product and engineering side to think about ways that we could attack something that, while they were technically capable of doing it, we could do better than them just by sheer focus and execution. And so definitely we saw an opportunity with this multi-LoRa inference in the second half of last year. I think that it was definitely on people's radars. There were some early blog posts about it, some research that was happening at institutions like University of Washington and UC Berkeley. but no one had really productized something in this space. And so we launched LoRAX in November of 2023 and really tried to make it clear that this was a paradigm shift for organizations, that instead of thinking about productionizing one specific model, one general purpose model, you could productionize hundreds or thousands of very narrow task specific models, but solve the essential question, which was how do you do that at scale in a way that doesn't break the bank, right? Because the previous conventional wisdom was every model is a GPU at a bare minimum. And so if you have hundreds of models, you have hundreds of GPUs and you're paying, tens and thousands of dollars per month, right? And so breaking down that conventional wisdom was the first way that we saw to attack this problem and establish ourselves as the goal, of course, being to establish ourselves as a thought leader in that particular space of like building these very task specific models in a way that's cost effective and scalable. And I think LoRA Land was a way of building on top of that, saying now that we have this foundational layer with LoRAX, here's what you can do with it. And I think that demo of being able to swap between all these different adapters that were better than GPT-4 at the specific tasks that they're doing and do it with sub-second latency, I think that started to prove to people that there's actually something real here. And it wasn't just, not to diminish research, but it wasn't just research. Like it's actually something that you can be using in your organization today.
I love reading the Predibase benchmarking reports and seeing how these various models do. And I think there's almost like a sense of fun, right? Every time a model comes out, how's it going to do? How well does it perform, relative to all these benchmarks and relative to all these other open source models out there? And because you guys are so close to this and have a great perspective, right now, Llama 3 launched. Meta just seems to be like they're crushing the open source model game right now. And obviously they're spending a lot of money and resources and time behind this. And it seems to be, initially resonating really well. Curious from you both, like how do you see the open source model world playing out over time? Is it feeling like we're going to have just a handful of providers of large, open source models, Llama, Mistral, Google, or do you think that there's going to be a world where we're going to see a long tail of developers and we're going to actually see many different types of open source models and providers of open source models?
Yeah. So I think my opinion on this is that I think it will break down a little bit by model class. I think that these larger foundational models, particularly the ones that people are open sourcing for general applicability as opposed to building internally on proprietary data to be IP in some way. I think that is a little bit constrained by the resources of these larger organizations, like that it's not something that's generally accessible to a small group of enthusiasts or something like that today. That might change in the future, but right now the two big barriers are you need lots and lots of compute and you need lots and lots of data. And both of those things are difficult to come by, right? So I do think that at least for the foreseeable future, there's going to be a requirement to lean onto some of these larger organizations like the Metas of the world to provide the foundational models. But where I do have a lot of optimism on the ability of less well-capitalized, the GPU core to be able to make inroads is definitely on the fine-tuning side. I think that as fine-tuning matures from the research point of view and from the data efficiency point of view, there's an opportunity to create like much better tailored models for specific tasks that do have general applicability that can potentially, be something that is valuable to lots of organizations beyond just the individual that made it. And I think once we start seeing that become true, I think that there's a whole new space of creators, like similar to how content creators create, art or videos or music or whatever, like being able to create fine tunes that attack very specific problems and have that be something that people consume at scale. That I think is a very interesting opportunity or a very interesting thing that I believe is coming on the horizon. And we've seen it to some extent in the computer vision space with diffusion models, where diffusion LoRAs for style transfer are starting to become mainstream, and people, communities around like finding different LoRAs that help adjust the way that the models generate images. I definitely think that moment is coming for large language models as well, where this sort of work moves beyond just being restricted to individual organizations that have lots of data to something that can be even more open and transparent and community driven.
Well, this leads me to my next question, which is for both of you, what do you think is overhyped and underhyped in AI today?
Overhyped today, I think, is chatbots. A lot of organizations, I think, started to see value in Gen AI actually post GPT-3, but when you kind of released an instruction tuned version of it for chat with ChatGPT. And I think the very first thought that organizations had was, I need ChatGPT for my enterprise. We were talking to some companies about a year ago, and they were like, I need ChatGPT for my enterprise. And I was like, great, what does that mean to you? They said, I don't know. I need to be able to ask the same ChatGPT style questions, but over my internal corpus. And so I think a lot of the early AI use cases have sort of looked like, how do I build a chatbot that, I can start to ask questions to over documents? And one of the main reasons for that is because the interface that went viral was ChatGPT. It was the ability to do this in a consumer setting. But the way I think about Gen AI models is you essentially have an unlimited army of high school trained humans, essentially, that can do different workflows. And if you had this kind of unlimited army of knowledge workers, is the most interesting thing you'd really apply them to just better Q&A and better chat? I struggle to think that's the case. And instead, where I think a lot of the case is actually going to be is in these automation workflows. These types of things are, we use the back of kitchen analogy, but there's also the back of office tasks, right? Ones that are just like repetitive, mundane. How do I go ahead and automate document processing? How do I need to go ahead and automate being able to reply to these items? And now we've started to see this become more of a thing. Of course, Klarna had their, I think, note a couple months ago about the customer service automation work that they were able to do. But I increasingly think that's where a lot of the future for AI is going to go. And so I think the kind of overhyped sentiment is all of these organizations that are saying, I want ChatGPT for my enterprise, probably want to start thinking a lot more about how do I consider the fact that I have, access towards this large essential talent pool that has general purpose knowledge and then can be fine-tuned to do a particular task very well. I think about it like a college specialization, right? I can take this high school level agent and give it kind of my college specialization in how Predibase does customer support, for example, and put it to work. That's kind of the biggest delta that I see from like what might be hyped in the market today and where I think a lot of the production workloads are going to be going over the next 12, 24 months.
Yeah, I liken it to saying that it's the boring AI that's really underhyped right now, but that's where most of the value is going to come from. I think that in any hype cycle, there's kind of this very overly optimistic view that like we're going to get 1000x productivity improvements because we're going to just replace every knowledge worker with an AI system of some sort. And I think that already we're starting to see the reality unfolding is that, it's actually not that easy. It's like, it's never that easy, right? Just by nature of these things, the 80-20 law, it's like getting the little details right end up being where the majority of effort is spent. But those things matter, right? So I think we're still quite a ways away from generalized intelligence and chat interfaces being able to do everything, right? Like replace coders and whatever. But certainly, I think that it's very real that we can get material productivity improvements and efficiency improvements on the order of like 20% here, 50% there on like very specific parts of the business. And it's going to be through these like very narrow applications, to Dev's point of saying, like we have a system here that requires humans to manually read all these documents. What if we can like automate that into like something that just turns it into a JSON or turns it into a SQL table for them, and they can just run a few quick, sanity checks on it and then send it downstream to the next system. Those are the sorts of things I can see having very meaningful impact on the bottom line of businesses. And those are the things that are actually attainable.
Yeah, that's part of the fun of this part of the hype cycle. Now, the initial euphoria has worn off. What are the really interesting things to build from here, right? Like, let's get in the nitty gritty and figure out something that may not have been just the initial, like, okay, let's go build this chatbot on top of GPT. There's so much more you can do with all of this. Guys, let's end with this. You both came from iconic companies as well as Piero, and you obviously have seen a lot of really interesting things and been around some great people, and you're all first-time founders. If you had to give one tip to a first-time founder, what do you think it would be? And maybe Travis, we'll start with you and Dev will end with you.
I think the biggest learning for me is that things are never, I think you're always a bit too ambitious when you start out with like what you think you can do as an individual or as an organization. Oftentimes, particularly if you spent most of your time being an individual contributor, you have this idea that, if I'm a good engineer and then we hire 10 good engineers, then we'll be 10x more productive and we can do all these amazing things. But the reality of doing something and then doing something well enough that people want to buy it and rely on it in production every day is quite a big gap. And so I think definitely being very narrow in terms of the type of problem that you want to tackle early on and say, let's do something very highly specific that maybe doesn't have a very big TAM in and of itself, but get that working perfectly and then start to think about where we go from there. That's definitely been the biggest learning for me, I'd say.
I'll give two really quickly. One tip I would say is be wary anytime someone suggests that you should pick something that's strategically important to your business. Pick your go-to-market motion or pick what you want your differentiator to be. I think a real risk that happens towards first-time founders is you kind of sit on a couch and you're like, hey, what can we do that would be really interesting? And that's a really interesting trap, I think, to be able to fall into that doesn't essentially take in the customer lens of what do customers actually care about. So I think a lot of first-time founders are very smart. They worked at iconic tech companies. They're like, I saw this happen at, let's say, a Google, or I saw this happen at an Uber. And so, the right way for the future is X, Y, Z. And that's a really good starting point, but that needs to be baked in what you're hearing directly from customers 100% of the time. And so I think it's actually very easy to essentially pick something that you think would be interesting, cool, and differentiated that customers just don't care about. And the reality is the thing that you're suggesting might be the right idea, but it's a different framing, it's a different form factor that you need. And you won't know whether or not you're right until somebody is willing to actually purchase an invoice and, send you money for it. And so make sure you hold that as kind of your primary objective function. And the last bit of advice that I think I'd liked a lot was everyone who's done startups, I think, has emphasized how important velocity is. And I think it's very easy to mix up velocity with, I need to go ahead and pull 16-hour days and just, get and be building a lot of code. To me, velocity is actually just building highly iteratively. How do you get feedback as soon as possible? Usually the easiest way to do that is what Travis's point is cutting scope. And so one of my favorite bits of advice that I've gotten, which is a bit controversial, is nothing takes longer than a week. And the reason that I've really liked that bit of advice is because I think it kind of forces you to think, how am I going to take whatever that I'm working on building this week and make sure that I understand at the end of the week, is it actually worth doing? Is it something that's putting me in the right direction? Is it delivering customer value? And so those are probably the two, it really is both about baking it into feedback and listening to customers, but understanding that you want to be able to optimize for that feedback cycle. And that's the only way that you'll probably get to where you're going.
Great advice from both of you. And it's super exciting to see everything going on at Predibase. And at least from the outside, I'm sure it's even, 10 times more exciting and incredible from the inside. So congrats to both of you on all the momentum and really excited to see where things go. Thanks, Dev and Travis.